So now the way I like to mix up my Tamiya acrylics for airbrushing. First step, obviously, you want to get it shaken up good. And then for a job this big where there's a lot of parts here and good size parts, and I find doing stuff like roll cages where there's so many small individual parts that are all hooked together, you end up going through quite a bit of paint to do it. So we're going to go ahead and just pour straight out of the bottle for this and get ourselves a pretty good amount there. And always make sure you clean off your bottles too. That way the caps don't seal themselves to the bottles. Don't usually have too much of a problem with that with Tamiya anyways, where the bottles are glass and the caps are plastic, whereas like the old Model Master paints with the glass bottles and the metal caps, they tend to stick together a lot better. But then we're going to go ahead and measure out our thinner here with a pipette. And we've got just about 10 milliliters of paint there. So we'll go ahead and start with about 3 milliliters of thinner. And then we'll get that mixed up and we'll see how that looks. Now a lot of times for a mixing stick I'll just use an old paintbrush. But you want to get that thinner mixed in there good. And what you're looking for is a consistency fairly close to milk. You want it to drip just about that easy. I always try to go for a little bit under thinned at first, and then if it ends up being too thick, I can always just add a little more thinner. So that should be good right there. And so I find a 10:3 ratio seems to work out pretty good for this paint. So for 10 milliliters of paint, add 3 milliliters of thinner. If you're doing 5 milliliters of paint, 1.5 milliliters of thinner, you know, so on and so forth. Now, because I want this chassis to be a gloss light gray, but the XF line of paints are flat paints, once these are all painted and dried, I'll go over them with some X22 gloss clear. Alright, so I've got my Iwata Eclipse HPCS here and the paint we mixed up. And then go ahead and start getting these chassis parts painted. Now I'm going to focus a little more on the parts of the chassis that will be visible through the body. This color should be pretty close to this primer gray, so more of the stuff that you won't really see, like the bottom side and things that are going to be hidden by the body, I'm not going to get that picky with the paint quality, just because it's not really all that big of a deal. Primarily just going to get some paint on the parts that we care about. So we've got something good to put a coat of clear over. Really make a nice glossy chassis gray. Now with this acrylic, don't be afraid to spray a nice wet coat right off the bat. This stuff dries super quick and it sprays on really well. Now you can see here on this chassis, I've stripped everything off of it, but I left the spring tension adjusters in the front. I just backed them all the way out and then wrapped some tape around the screw heads. That way the threads don't get gummed up with paint at all. But I didn't really feel they needed to be removed. And honestly, you could probably leave most of the chassis assembled for painting it. But I figured it'd be easier just to go ahead and completely disassemble everything, where I was going to have to take the electronics out of it anyways. So now doing things like this, an airbrush is so nice for, because you have much better paint control versus with, say, rattle cans. So you can really get the paint exactly where you want it. You don't end up wasting as much. So I'll go ahead and get the rest of these chassis parts painted, and then we'll move on to painting some more of the other stuff. Alright, so we've got all the chassis parts painted. Now we're moving on to some of the other stuff. So you can see here, I've got the air cleaner. Decided to do a little experiment, and instead of priming these parts, I'm just spraying Model Car World paints right out of the jar, right directly onto the bare plastic. So this is their Mill 2100 bare metal gloss lacquer. We've got 2 coats on here so far, and I think just a couple more and it should look pretty good. This stuff sprays really well. It's pretty hard to make it run, and it dries very fast. So now we'll see how we can do on the headers here. Just like any paint, you really want to start with lighter coats and then build it up over time. Usually I'll do 2 light coats and then start in with some heavier coats. Now these headers, we might actually only end up doing a couple of light coats to kind of make them a darker metal, and then we'll also do some other detail painting and weathering on these, and I'll show you that when we get to it. But we'll go ahead and get all these bare metal parts painted, and then we'll go ahead and throw some color on that engine block. Alright, so now we've got some 1401 Chevy engine red in here. We're going to go ahead and paint up our 2 engine block halves. So same thing with these, just spraying the MCW right over the bare plastic, no primer. And the MCW paint is pre-thinned, and it's right at the perfect consistency for spraying. So we'll just start with light coat to kind of get everything sticking. Now something like this with this red, where a Chevy engine red is a brighter red, almost more of an orange, you really should prime something like this with preferably a white primer or a very light gray primer so it covers better. But we're not too worried about it. We're really only interested in getting just a layer of something on here, so that when we come back with the Tamiya acrylics to pick out the intake manifold and the valve covers with a different color, we've got something for the paint to stick to. All we really care about getting to be a nice shade of Chevy engine red is the block itself. But we'll just build it up over time and should come out looking alright. Alright, so now we've got all the airbrushing done. You can see I went ahead and I gave the air cleaner a coat of MCW gloss clear. Really made that pop. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to start detail painting everything. So I've got a bunch of colors here that I'm going to work with. I've got X1 gloss black, we got X11 chrome silver that I'm going to use to do the fill neck insert on the fuel cell detail. You can see we went ahead and painted that with Tamiya X7 gloss red. No clear coat on that. That Tamiya gloss sprays really nicely. So we've already got that bolted back into its portion of the chassis. And we've also got some X12 gold leaf that we're going to use on what would be the oil pan on the engine. There's like a Milodon aftermarket kind of oil pan. Then we've got XF16 flat aluminum that we're going to use for what would be the cylinder heads. And then we've also got some XF56 metallic gray, which is a really nice, almost a steel color. As well as some XF85 rubber black for the padding and the headrest. And then we've also got XF3 flat yellow and X4 blue that we're going to use to paint the driver's helmet, as well as the Lexan driver figure. And those should match up fairly decently with the wrap scheme that we're going to be going with on this car. And then we're also going to use, I'm not 100% sure yet, either XF55 deck tan, XF57 buff, or potentially XF93 light brown for doing the filter element portion of the air cleaner. Now, Tamiya Acrylics brush paint, very good right out of the bottle. You can thin them down a little bit if you want them to flow better, and that can really help eliminate a lot of brush strokes, but I don't really find that that's usually necessary. And I just use a little bit of 91% isopropyl alcohol to clean my brushes with. So we'll go ahead and get started here on the fuel cell. Usually all I do is I'll open up my jar, make sure you shake it real good or mix it up real good. I usually just shake it, and then I'll actually take my paint off of the inside of the cap rather than out of the jar itself. And we'll just carefully paint that detail without getting paint where we don't want it. And for smaller stuff like this, the finer the brush that you can get, the better off you are. I usually buy all my brushes in sets on Amazon. You can get some really nice brushes for really good prices in just about any size you'd ever want. Because unfortunately, I don't really have a hobby shop local to me. I've got a great RC shop that's local to me, but nothing for, you know, more like model car related type stuff. So I'm pretty much reduced to buying all of that stuff online, but we'll set that somewhere out of the way so that can dry up. And I do believe that's all we need the X11 for, so we can set that aside. Alright, so now moving on to the engine block halves. I think we're going to go ahead and start with our XF16 flat aluminum. And get those cylinder heads and probably the bell housing as well with this. And we're going to use a little bit bigger brush here. I find a lot of these Tamiya acrylics are very easy to cover in one coat, but some of them, particularly these metallic colors, especially the lighter ones like this flat aluminum, they really need a couple of coats to cover fully. But the nice thing about the acrylics is they dry super fast, and if they're not drying fast enough for you, you can just hit them with a blow dryer or a heat gun and they'll harden up almost instantly. So you can really get a lot accomplished in a short amount of time with them. Especially if you're airbrushing, so you can really get thin coats. And we're also going to go ahead and do the cylinder heads on these. Or at least kind of an approximation of where they would be. Now I'm not going to worry too much about getting some of this aluminum color up on the valve cover because I'll be painting that afterward. The same with these header flanges here. I'll be painting those a different color as well. I just need to be careful I don't get it on what would be the engine block because we want that to stay orange. And we're just gonna kind of make a line here to approximate where that cylinder head would actually go. And while I'm right here, I'm also going to go ahead and paint out that intake manifold detail. Find another thing with these metallic colors is you really want to keep them mixed up well because the metallic starts to settle in them very quickly. Alright guys, so we got a bunch of stuff painted here. We've got the engine halves all painted up nice. Got the headrest painted up. Made a pretty good start on the driver. And now I'm working on the headers. Now to get a heat stained look, like a heat stained stainless header, is pretty easy. All you really need is, number one, paint your headers with a bare metal look paint. And then all you need is 3 different colors. X19 smoke, X26 clear orange, and X23 clear blue. You start with the smoke, and I use this at full strength on the brush, brush it over everything, kind of let it pool up in the areas like here where the tubes meet the collectors. And then for the orange and the blue, what you're actually going to do is dry brush it on. And you can vary how bright the orange and the blue come out based on how much you have on the brush. I tend to like to let it go a little brighter up towards where the headers would come out of the heads, and then fade it out as you get towards the end of the tailpipe. So I've got the orange done. Now I'll show you real quick exactly how I do it here with the clear blue. You know, the biggest thing is just, you know, try to find some pictures of some real headers that have a look that you want to try to emulate and play around with it a little bit. So again, I just take it right out of the cap, wipe the brush off with a paper towel, and go in and just dry brush it on there. And with the blue, I like to try to keep it outside of the orange so that it kind of encapsulates the orange. That way you get more of a gradient. So basically wherever there's orange, you want blue around it. And there's really no right or wrong way to do it. You know, just play around with it. Play around with different techniques. Find what works best for you and what you think looks the best, and have fun with it. You know, and I like to try to go little by little and build it up over time. That way, as I'm going, if I don't quite like it yet, I can add more. But I don't have to worry about going too far with the effect. So I think that right there is about good for these. So I'll go ahead and do the other one, and then I'm going to let them dry up good, and then I'm going to go ahead and add some pigments to them to really make them pop. Alright, so we've got the engine assembly all put back together. Definitely looks a lot better than what it did just all bare black plastic. So now we can go ahead and start getting everything else put back together. Got the driver all done up as good as I'm going to get it. So now we try to figure out the puzzle.